All right, I'll start again. As we gather tonight for the annual budget meeting, we are missing one person who historically attended these budget meetings and many other school board meetings, kind, gracious, friendly Eddie English. Gripping his newspaper handout with budget aspects underlined, he was a faithful town citizen in his efforts to understand the budget, asked questions always politely and respectfully. May we all be like Eddie in our quest for information, assuming best intentions and always trying to understand so that he could be supportive and not obstructive. Thank you, Eddie. Your parents were always proud of you. Your mother told me that at church one day with you by her side. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ben and Jim.
All right, well, thanks everybody for coming tonight or dialing in on Zoom. Can the folks on Zoom hear me okay? Also good? Okay. Let me share my screen again. I'm going to bounce around among some materials that we've worked with in getting to the budget that we're going to be presenting to taxpayers for town meeting day. See if I can get this to go into present mode. There we go. But what I'd like to do is if people have questions as we go, please interrupt me. Let's make this as much of a discussion. Don't have to save things till the end. This is complicated stuff. Vermont education financing has always been complicated. This is probably my 5th time going through this stuff, so it all makes sense to me, but I recognize that there are people for whom this may be your first time and who don't work with this stuff as much. So by all means, interrupt, raise your hand, say, can we go over that again? Or, if you've got some insights, please share. I'll do my best to be attentive. So here's our budget information session. This is our overview. I'm just going to give everybody a sneak preview of the town tax rates right up front in case you don't have a great long attention span. The good news on the takeaway is that for 6 out of the 7 towns in our school district, town tax rates are projected to go down for FY26. That's on the information that we have from the state. I'll also kind of net out the big takeaways from this budget season in my too long didn't read it version up front. For those who want to dive into the details, we will do a little walkthrough. It'll be familiar to school board members or others who've attended this and other budget sessions before, just breaking down the mechanics of how Vermont ed funding works. Then we'll talk about the things that drove our decision-making as a school board, the significant developments, kind of the things that we keep our eye on from year to year. And then we'll talk about the last year's yield bill. That's a piece of legislation that had some surprises in it for us that really set the course in terms of making a number of budget cuts that if anybody's been following in the news, we were kind of put in a position to have to make this year. We'll talk about our priorities coming out of that, and then I'll go over some of the scenarios that we considered in setting the tax rate. So here's, like I said, the sneak preview of the town tax rates. You can see the bottom line, literally, of that slide in your town is the change to the tax rate in percentage from last year. You can see the actual tax rate, and these are all projections based on the information that we have from the state now. We get probably, 80% of our information from as of December 1st when the state releases the tax letter, the tax commissioner's letter. And that's kind of what we work from when we set budgets for town meeting day. But these are all subject to change as the legislature does its work in session. So as you can see, for 6 out of the 7 towns, we're seeing decreases to tax rates. The too long didn't read it version, when the tax commissioner came out with the December 1 letter, he projected a statewide increase of about 6%, 5.9%. Last year, there was an alarm that was sounded in that same letter, and they were saying an 18.5% increase. So just from a trend, that's significantly less in terms of what they're looking at statewide. That's a statewide average for districts that didn't make as probably as aggressive cuts as we have, or to the budget. And as you've seen, our tax rates are coming in at the town level significantly lower than that. Those cuts were due to the reintroduction of what we call colloquially penalty phase. That was an aspect of the funding formula. For many years, the states would set what's formally called the excess spend threshold. That's the per pupil spend, how much money a school district can spend per pupil. And that's set statewide, and anything that you spend above that, the penalty phase is that for every dollar you spend per student above that, you have to send 2 to Montpelier, right? So they double tax you if you go above that threshold. That threshold was set this year with a new kind of approach. It was based on statewide average, 118% of average school expenditure. And so that was something that when we ran the numbers on our current budget, we were in a position, unfortunately, to have to make significant cuts to avoid it. I want to be clear, the bold language on this, because there's been some misprints in local papers that no unified arts programs or elementary preschool programs have been cut in this budget. That's something that people should be very clear about. It's an intentional decision of the board, and we'll go through some of the things that we considered in arriving at that decision. And then when we run the numbers from the state, we see that I think one of the significant surprises for the board was that with the projected numbers from the state, that even going into penalty phase doesn't result in significant impacts to the tax rate. We are still able to lower taxes based on the significant budget cuts, even though we do have some exposure to penalty phase with this budget. And that's really the big takeaways. I'll stop there before I dive into the details of the presentation. Any questions or clarifications people have? Paige?
The CLAs that were on that board are the current CLAs that are going into the tax rate.
Oh, this one, you mean these CLAs?
Yeah,
Yeah, those are the ones that are available from the state now.
okay, because when it was printed, it had zeros on it. I'm like, that's impossible.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, so that goes into our tax sheet then.
Correct.
And then, Woodstock is saying, about a 3% increase, so that brings us to around 0.6, 0.7%.
26.
Here,
26, 27.
percent property tax.
You look-
Correct?
It's 2.6 per $100 of property value, 2.6
Okay.
cents. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this may just be for the folks in this room or who have this report. The table in the report is misprinted.
Okay, that's unfortunate.
So the line that shows your property tax rate for your town for this year is actually the third from the bottom.
Oh, the labels are off.
Yeah, the top 2 lines of numbers are sort of extra. And so you can see that the labels for what each row.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
There's 2 fewer labels than there are rows of numbers. There's 2 extra rows of numbers at the top.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I know.
On the screen.
Yeah.
The screen is correct.
Yeah. The screen.
Screen is X.
That's it. Yeah. I think we're working from the same spreadsheet. There were some hidden rows that probably got unhidden when they went to the printer. I think that was the these adjustment numbers from last year. That's unfortunate, but let's get the straight dish tonight. Anything else before we dive into the details? Okay, great. So let's do a little walkthrough of how Vermont education funding works. First off, let's just look at how the state pays for education. There is a centralized state education fund, and for the current fiscal year, it's about $2.3 billion that the state of Vermont has to raise to pay for local school budgets. These are the sources of that by percentage. And what we're talking about tonight is this blue quadrant at the bottom, which is the homestead property tax, about 26%, about a quarter of the taxes that get raised to pay for school operations in the state come from essentially locals, right? People who live in Vermont full time. The other, by far and away, the biggest source is the non-homestead property tax. That's both second homeowners and businesses across the state, business properties. So as you can imagine, that's a lot of dollars. And then sales and use taxes are about the same as homestead property taxes, and then various other sources chip in to contribute to the ed fund. So for the school budget, and this is a walkthrough of how we arrive at the town tax rate that you've already seen, but you take the overall expenditure budget in the current year and next year, it's right around $30 million, and you take away local revenue to get to what's called education spending. Local revenue are things like grant dollars that come in, tuition dollars from students who decide to come, like school choice towns. That's what we call local revenue. Anything that you don't have to raise from the taxpayer is local revenue. Education spending is what essentially you have to go to the taxpayer to get. So that's why it affects the tax rate. So you take that education spending, and there's a term here that just means pupils, right? Long-term weighted average daily membership. That's the head count. It's weighted in Vermont. So the number that we use, it has a correlation, obviously, to how many students are in the building, but given various factors, that has a weighting to it. So you take your education spending, divide it by the number of students, that gives you your per pupil spend, and you want to stay beneath the excess spending threshold that I talked about before. If you don't, you go into that penalty phase like I talked about. The red on this slide is new this year. So for many years, we've taken our per pupil spend and divided it by something called the property yield. That's essentially just a figure that comes out from the state in that December 1st letter. And it's a reflection of the health of the state education fund. They take projections earlier in the year and they say, how much money do we need to raise from taxpayers? And they set the yield number accordingly. That number is adjusted this year, and it's adjusted by a factor of about 72%. And that's an adjustment to how the CLA gets calculated in the formula, which we'll see on the next slide. It's just a tweak to the formula and something that we've had to factor into our calculations. And it makes it difficult to do apples to apples comparisons from year to year, some of the things that go into the budget. But essentially, you take your per pupil spend, divided it by that formula, or that factor that comes out from the state. That gives you the equalized tax rate. That means the tax rate that applies the same to every town in the district before you apply the CLA. And then you divide by the CLA, also subject to that new statewide adjustment, to get the town tax rate. Applying that to, here we go. Applying that to the FY26 budget, these are the actual numbers that we get. And you can see here, there's an historical look back all the way to FY21. So going back about 5 years to see kind of how our overall expenditure budget has grown over time, what the local revenues are. As you can see, last year there was a dip in those local revenues. I think that was largely due to a shortfall in grant funding. But we're back up about $1 million. That was very helpful because that's money that we didn't have to raise from taxpayers. You see education spending is down significantly. And if you follow the trend, that's a pretty significant accomplishment on that line by the school board. You see that number going up by, $1 million, $1 million, $3 million, $5 million, and then to have it come down by almost $1 million this year is really what's driving those reductions to the tax rate. And that's the result of those the tax cuts that I talked about. We'll talk more about.
Ben, your second line is that there should not be brackets around that 990, correct? Because that's an increase in the local revenues.
It's an increase. Is it a decrease? No, it is, you're right, that those brackets should not be there. Change it, but it's on slow. That is an increase in local revenue, correct? Yep, thanks, Charlie. That's an increase of 22%. So the pupils, we did see, I'll go into more of the budget drivers here, but we do see a decrease of 53 weighted equalized pupils on our kind of head count. So that's why when you go to the next line, you see that even though our education spending is down, our per pupil spending is slightly up by 1% because of that, the number of weighted pupils that were down. Then the property yield, that has an asterisk on it because again, that's it's subject to that statewide adjustment. Tough to make a comparison from last year to this. Same thing with the equalized tax rate. The rate looks like it's going way up, but that's because it's been adjusted by that statewide adjustment on the equalized. But you see that the town tax rate comes down. So let me go back to, let's see, yep. Here's the drivers. Here are the things that we look at, that I mentioned earlier, that are kind of the big rocks each year that we keep an eye on because they have the greatest impact to our budget. We audit 2 years in arrears. So FY '24 was last year. That completed. We're now in FY '25, working on the FY '26 budget, and we can see that we did a little better than our budget. So we're expecting a small surplus, but really not enough to impact the budget. But it's good not to, see that, hurting us. Like I said, the enrollment, that's the long-term weighted average daily membership. Number 2 is down by 53 students. The property yield is also down, but it's, like I said, difficult to, kind of see how meaningful that is from last year to the next. Health insurance was a big one this year. It almost always is a very painful piece of the puzzle that we have to solve for. You'll see on a future slide that this translates to about $300,000 that we have to, come up with in the budget to be able to make good on our health insurance obligations to our employees. And that's not anything that we have the ability at the school district level to negotiate or do much about. We just kind of take a number that comes from the state. And then that yield bill that reintroduced the penalty phase, that was a very significant development in our budget driver discussions. Essentially saying we would have to come up with about $3 million in cuts to avoid penalty phase entirely. And then the CLA, what we're seeing as a statewide trend is that the CLAs are cooling off, right? The Vermont real estate market is not as hot as it was during the pandemic, and as a result, the impacts to tax rates are significantly less. So the yield bill did a couple things. Like I said a couple times, that excess spending threshold penalty phase came back. That I have to say, it took us by surprise, because when they adjusted the weighting of pupils last year, there was a piece of legislation called Act 127 that updated the pupil weights. They also extended a COVID era moratorium on the penalty phase until 2030. So as a district, and we're doing our budget planning, we were not expecting to contend with the excess spend threshold for another 5 years. But as a result of trying to address some of the concerns that were coming out of Montpelier, the legislature brought back penalty phase with the yield bill. The yield bill typically just gives us numbers, right? It just says, here's the final yield, and it's about a page. This one had a lot of activity in it as a result of legislative activity. Then the excess spending threshold, as I said before, got set at 118% of the FY '25 average statewide per pupil spending. And so, when we came in above that, that's what, gave us the kind of the mandate to be in budget reduction mode. Let's see, the next thing, and this was something that was fortunate for us based on the contents of our current budget, and that is those who've been following school district activity for the last couple of years know that we were hard at work on trying to replace the building that we're sitting in right now. And in the process of trying to fix some of the things that went wrong with the building recently, replacing the heating system in the high school, also trying to prepare architectural plans for the new design, we wound up borrowing about $5 million, right? And that amount was significant because we were set to pay it back over about 5 years. And the reason I'm talking about that is because school construction has always been exempted from the excess spending threshold calculation. You don't go into penalty phase for paying your debt service on a school bill, right? But the legislature took all those exemptions out, and they replaced it with one single exemption. And they said that principal and interest payments for bonds approved prior to July 1st, 2024 would not be included in education spending. So working with district council, we were able to convert the $5 million worth of debt that we'd taken out to bonds. And in doing that, we were able to avoid about $1 million worth of penalty phase. So that was a significant gain, thanks to our own Jim Fenn in the business office that worked to get that done. Okay, so kind of going in, coming out with that picture that we had, those, various budget drivers and things, we knew that we're looking at having to cut nearly $3 million. That was a little bit of a moving target. We thought initially it was about $2.5 million. And then also having to add on top of that, finding money for the increase to health insurance costs. So looking at cutting $3.2 million from a $26 million education spending was our task to avoid penalty phase. So we, Jim and Sherry came to the finance committee, which I chair, and we're given direction to stay out of penalty phase. That was the kind of the mandate that we gave first, but we also provided some other guidance in terms of how to go about making such significant cuts to the school budget. And I'm going to switch over to the presentation that Sherry gave to the board when she came back to explain, how the team went about it. So the factors considered for budget reductions, and Sherry, you can keep me honest since this is your deck. But first and foremost is reducing impact to students, making cuts that had the least impact. So things that we talked about at finance and, directed the administration to do were, if you have low enrollment in certain programs, those would be ones that would be up for being cut. If you have programs that can be replaced by online learning or community resources, right? And students can, essentially have equivalent sort of experiences elsewhere, then maybe look at those kinds of things. Then also following the teaching and learning policy or portrait of a graduate and strategic plan goals, trying to adhere to those. And in doing that, it was really about committing to the investments that we made during the pandemic about increasing our literacy and math scores across the district, and also the investments we've made in pre-K, right? Those are things that we see the results of those investments paying off, and we don't want to abandon them, right? And then making sure that there's equal sort of, if not totally equal, dispersion of those reductions across all the schools, programs in the central office. Our class and course enrollment numbers, obviously, like I said, were things that we wanted to factor in to the impact on students, and then making sure that those reductions are sustainable. This slide talks about really just our collective bargaining agreement limitations. About 80% of the district's costs are people costs, right? And those are dictated largely by negotiations with the teachers union. And so there are, certain sorts of considerations that had to be taken into account when talking about which reductions we would make to headcount. And then when the finance committee and the board met with the administration in a number of sessions as we went through budget season between, say, July and December, there were some kind of creative approaches that we came up with. First was to offer a buyout option for all faculty and staff with more than 5 years in the district. We also have an incentive for opting out of district insurance because it's very expensive. We essentially pay our employees. We say, hey, here's a little bit of an annual bonus. If you don't take the insurance, like if you have a spouse that has insurance coverage and you can use that, then we'll give you a little bonus. And so we increased that incentive amount. Also went to the administration met with the principals and said, okay, you essentially have to come up with X amount in your building, right? To reduce, give us some options on how to get there. The principals came back with 3 options. Those options were presented to the board, and the board said that's the one that we're most interested in. So there were some, some options that were considered. That financial restructure that I talked about with the bonded debt for 1.1 million was a huge piece. And then obviously the finance committee and the board were, impressed with how much work went into being able to make those cuts. So the reductions just by numbers. Now this is going to come out to about $2.4 million, right? A little bit short of the 2.9 that we were initially going for. Like I said, it was a little bit of a moving target based on the numbers that we got from the state. But you can see the biggest piece of that was on the right-hand side is that debt restructuring. Then you see cuts at the elementary school level around 730,000 to the middle school and high school around 300,000. Same thing with the central office. So there you see that dispersion of cuts across the different locations. In terms of the details of at each of those kind of locations, I won't drain all these slides, but you'll see, various components of what was being changed in the budget and taken out in order to achieve those numbers. So this is the central office, losing some of these positions and consolidation. Barnard Academy, looking at losing an unfilled position, a paraeducator position, in half of a classroom teacher. We see program cost reductions across the board. It's the equipment, furniture, supplies, just tightening the belts. Killington, same thing, to a classroom teacher and a paraeducator. Sherry, was that due to pre-K demand?
Correct.
Okay. That was something that we could kind of flex in response to how many students who are actually looking at having to provide pre-K for. To be clear, there was still pre-K at Killington. But this was a reduction in, based on the kind of ebbs of enrollment up there. Reading, just program cost reductions for Reading. Then Prosper Valley, same game. Woodstock, having a half-time interventionist go to Prosper, losing a para that was an unfilled position. And then at across all elementary schools, and this became the most kind of controversial aspect of the budget, as we got community feedback, but it was looking at removing a part-time music teacher, art teacher, a STEM teacher, and a position and a half of Spanish from the elementary schools. Then at the high school, we were looking at a part-time math teacher, a part-time science, a half of a math teacher, half of a science teacher, half position teaching French, the Latin program, and the allocation for the library paraprofessional.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did you have any of those latest slides printed out for the public?
No, we have in prior. You can get these in the minutes of prior board meetings, and I can also put them up on the minutes of this meeting.
It would really be helpful for the community.
Sure.
And just for clarification, this is not the budget that's going to be voted on. This is the process that we went through to get to the budget. So this is not a reflective of the current budget.
Okay, it still would have been nice for the public. Question, not to-
Yeah, it's always available on the website and it's always available during our board meetings.
So let's go back to the presentation. So that was what the administration, after the finance committee said, you have to remember, this is in, summer and fall timeframe. We're trying to avoid that penalty phase, right? They've got their mandate, they're coming back. People are taking those buyouts, people are moving their insurance. It's all negotiated, right? With those restrictions with the teachers union. Very diligent work by our administration to come back with that. So from there, you see what those potential budget adjustments were, right? There was significant community backlash, I can say, in this room and on Zoom and in the listservs, to cuts to the Unified Arts program. Those were things like PE and STEM and foreign language and visual and performing arts, right? At our elementary schools. So as a result, the board in December decided not to touch Unified Arts, right? That's both at the elementary schools and in the high school Latin and French programs, right? And you see those impacts. That's about $500,000 that we were trying to avoid penalty phase, but we said, you know what? It's more important to our communities to be in to have these robust offerings for our elementary school students than to reduce the to stay out of penalty. And as you can, we didn't know until December what the yield number from the state would be or what the actual financial impacts would be. And it was nice that we could still offer district taxpayers tax reductions while preserving these programs. I think in just about any other year with the yield numbers that have come out from the state, we would have been looking at pretty significant hit to the tax rate if we had made a decision like this. But we were in a position that we had a little bit of room to play with. Then in looking, with this kind of new yield number, we looked at and said, those halftime high school math and science teachers, those are really important to be able to offer as many of the AP courses that we do for getting our high school students ready for college. And so we made the decision to preserve those positions as well. Jim identified in the December, January timeframe that if we raise tuition to the school choice students who we have, and there's like 88 or so across the district, by $1,500, that would actually bring us up to about a benchmark that we could justify. And that would, avoid about $120,000 worth of penalty phase. And then basically talk to our sports coaches and people who are in charge of our co-curricular and after school programs and said, can we all just tighten our belts by 10%, right? Similar to what we did with the high school principals to say, look, you got X amount of dollars to hit. We also want to see that happen across the sports programs and co-curriculars. And then another thing that we considered was, we don't get as much headcount or benefit to our finances from 3-year-old pre-Ks. So we thought, what if we eliminate the 3-year-old pre-K option? But in considering that against some of our original goals that we set out, recognizing the investments that we made, the benefits that we get from getting students into our school buildings sooner than later, opted not to do that. And that's what you see on this next slide. We kind of took all of those adjustments except for the elimination of the 3-year-old pre-K. And unfortunately, the standard, they did run a correction, but they initially published that we had cut 3-year-old pre-K. And that's unfortunate. We hope that voters know that 3 and 4-year-old pre-K are still being offered at all of our elementary schools. Let me stop there. That was a lot. Paige?
Raising it by 1,500, does that go above the pupil spend that the state allows you? You know how we have a per pupil spend of about $17,000?
Correct.
Does this go above that pupil spend?
What is the tuition rate itself?
It's several $1,000s above that, but you have to understand that per pupil spend is based on about 1,500 FLTW students, and we have less than 1,000. And so, within the announced and allowable tuitions, we're still a couple thousand below the allowable tuition floor.
So there is an allowable.
Yeah. There's an allowable, and this year's allowable was still almost $2,500 more than we're proposing for next year.
Yeah, and we've got, what is it, about 990 students?
Yeah.
Right? But you take the 88 tuition students out of that, and that gets you down to around 900 students, and that translates to 1,500 of those LTW ADM. And so when you look at that, 1,700 number there, it's not really comparable to the tuition.
Yeah, and my other question for you is, what was the negotiated increase in salaries for teachers?
I wouldn't know off the top of my head.
It was, the first year was 8%, which is this current year,
This year was 8%.
Okay,
and then it goes down to 5%.
okay. And then when was the last time they saw double-digit increases in the healthcare costs? Like double-digit?
Last year? So last year was it
16%.
16? Yeah, last year was really painful.
Last year,
Right.
for this year was 16%.
Right.
For next year is 12%.
I would say 3 or 4 years ago, Paige. It's been a while that we've
That's
been
what I
below.
thought.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
Okay,
Yeah, and it was the pandemic because everybody was staying at home and not
Right.
using their health insurance.
And they're
Yeah.
projecting that it will go up 12% again for the next following 2 years. Each year.
All right, so now we can look at the tax rate calculations. We've seen this slide already. This is just kind of level set here. So this is where we were last year at this time, what we were telling our school districts based on the yield information that we had. A lot was up in the air because we knew the legislature was going to be aggressive in terms of they're trying to address that announced 18% statewide increase to education tax rates. So this is what we were looking at, pretty significant increases, and it got worse. The yield came in worse than was expected. And so you saw two things happen. One, for the towns that didn't do a reappraisal, the tax rates were way worse. On the bottom right, we were looking at like 26% in Woodstock. That went up over 30%. So, we do the best we can with the numbers we have in, February and March, but there's a lot of activity that happens, after that. 3 of our towns completed reappraisals, and as a result, their CLA reset and the tax rate resets with that, right? And so you see on paper, the tax rate in Barnard, in Bridgewater, in Reading, coming down significantly. That does not mean that people's tax bills were coming down significantly, right? When you take a home that was once valued at $200,000 and you raise it to $500,000, even though your tax rate's coming down 20%, the amount of money that they have to pay in taxes goes up significantly. And anybody in Bridgewater will tell you that's exactly what happened. Now, if you compare that to this year, however, we don't have any at this stage of the game. I think Killington's due for a reappraisal. I don't know if Woodstock has got it. All right,
when Killington's bills come out, they'll be on the new appraised values, but we didn't have them, and we still don't have them.
Right, right. So I guess my point is to say those towns that did a reappraisal last year that are seeing like 10 and 3 and 11% reductions will actually see reductions to their tax bills, right, in those amounts, right? That's more meaningful to the taxpayer than just the rates going down. Plymouth, that's a function of their real estate market still being Plymouth and I would say Plymouth and Reading were probably the 2 places in the school district that were a little bit on the tail end of that big spike in real estate market values. Killington was at the front end. Woodstock, Barnard, Pomfret were right behind, and then you see Bridgewater, Plymouth, and Reading kind of a little bit later on the trend. So that's why Plymouth still is showing a 10% increase, is because their CLA is still kind of hot, right? I can go into the various scenarios. I guess I'll put them up because this, I think, was a really important kind of exercise for the board. When we got the real numbers from the state in terms of the yield, how that would all play out, and then how the various cuts that we were looking at making would actually play out on the tax rate. So let me hold these up. See, make this as big as I can. I apologize. These are not as pretty as some of the other things that not so big. I guess just okay, great. So you can see this. These are the numbers that we ultimately went with as a board. And this was a scenario where, we took the administration's recommendations, added back the unified arts, added back the high school and math and science teachers, reducing that co-curricular by 10%, increased the tuition rate. That's how we got to that those tax rates that you've seen. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum where we started, these are all just different scenarios, right? The original proposal wasn't all that different in terms of the tax rate, right? In Woodstock, you're looking at, about a percentage, maybe percentage and a half difference. If we had, and we, looked at, different scenarios there. This scenario here, for those who are really concerned about penalty phase, you can see that not a huge difference, right? If we were to try to stay completely out of penalty phase, but to achieve that would have been devastating for programs at the school district level. You're talking about having to cut that 3-year-old pre-K, if not all pre-K from our elementary schools, having to reduce bus routes so that you've got, people having to drive kids to school who haven't had to do that in the past. I know other board members in the room, you might.
Well, yeah, if you
when you get rid of programs like language and art, or reduce them so much that, you know, parents take their kids out of the district, or if you're getting rid of certain APs in the high school that are really meaningful to kids at that moment in their education career, their parents will take them out of our district. We see that all the time. We see kids who, for various reasons, leave. And this would have propelled that like departure. And then when you rerun these numbers with fewer kids in the district, our taxes go up.
Correct. Yep. It's penny wise, pound foolish. Right. So we were trying to kind of do our best to hit a sweet spot, you know, in terms of what we were offering retaining students in a year where we really had to make a lot of cuts. Various scenarios, but you can see the spread, right? You know, for Woodstock, a reduction of 6.5% to completely avoid penalty phase, to where we landed at around, you know, 3.2%. Excuse me, 3%, right? And everybody's seeing that reduction. So that's, I guess that's all that I had to present this evening. Are there questions or discussion from those in attendance or on Zoom? Seeing none. Okay. Well,
And I have one question.
sure.
So did I misunderstand you? I know that there's a new threshold in the penalty phase. Did you go over the penalty phase?
We do have some exposure to penalty phase. To get out of penalty phase, like I said, we would have had to make, you know, $3.2 million worth of cuts.
Okay.
And that's what I was talking about when
That's
Matt
what I
was
thought. I
commenting on.
misunderstood you.
Yeah,
Okay.
but this is, with that exposure to penalty phase, this is the projected tax rate.
Okay.
And it just was not as, like, I don't know, you, from the time that I joined the board and, you know, was on finance with you, Paige, we were always just, you know, got to stay away from penalty, right? That was the mandate. But, you know, this year, just seeing what that yield number was looking like, here's the projected numbers.
But that projected number it pays for that penalty.
It does.
phase. It doesn't roll over to the next year.
Correct.
And if you have surplus from that year, like if you. Does that make sense? So you go over the penalty phase, but if you end up having surplus that you had not expected.
Mhm.
Can that roll over into your surplus then for the next tax year?
Yes.
If I'm.
Yeah, it's that 2-year look back I was talking about with the audit, right? It would be, you know, there'd be a delay on it, but
Right, okay.
We're so tight though, Paige.
Yeah,
Those
no,
three-
I understand, but
Yeah,
that's how I
exactly.
remember it.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
It just-
Skips a
It
year.
rolls over
Yeah.
if you have it,
Right.
if you have it.
It's a
right.
bit-
Yeah, we've been pretty good since Jim came aboard, you
There's
know.
a question online.
Amelia,
Hi, thank you so much for your work and your presentation, and thanks for adding the UA back. My question is about the reduction in staff at Barnard Academy, because even though on paper it looks like a half person, my understanding is that it's removing kind of a whole classroom and that pre-K and kindergarten will then be combined. So I'm just curious, you know, what options are there for potentially reversing that and keeping that half person intact, like if there's an increase in enrollment or without like voting down the budget, for example, if we were hoping to see that half person stay at Barnard.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, one of the things that we talk about, finance and at the board level is, you know, the legislature going into session now, just like last year when they went to work on, you know, the 18% number, they're also going to be, there's, you know, huge changes afoot. I don't know if you're familiar with the governor's proposal to completely restructure the, you know, the education system in the state, right? So we expect the legislature to be busy again this year. And if the yield number were to come in significantly better than, you know, what we were expecting, we could potentially revisit positions. That said, Sherry will tell you that there is a hiring season for district employees, and for this next year, it's probably very unlikely that we would make changes to staffing. But I won't speak for you on that, Sherry, if that's put words in your mouth.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate what Melissa Zohad, the principal, did at Barnard, because when we look at, and if you're in the newspaper, you look at the numbers across Barnard, we really haven't had that number of pre-K enrollment. We start advertising for pre-K in November. We look for the numbers and that's where we base our decision. So looking at the current pre-K enrollment combined with the number of students in kindergarten, that brings us to about 12, at most 20 students at a pre-KK. So what she did creatively is that she's taken her half-time interventionist and using the other half of that position to help with that larger group of sixth grade students who can then get very specific math instruction. So I really appreciate what Melissa has done. She's looking at her overall numbers and per student spend. So one of the other things that policy dictates is that we look at every single campus and look at what the per student spend is. And Barnard's numbers have been much higher as compared to the other elementary schools and middle school and high school. So I think what Melissa's recommendation was is really cost effective. We have a pre-KK at Reading. Melissa actually went down to see the pre-KK in Reading and really, was impressed by the quality of the student experience there. So I think her recommendation really was with students in mind, but also allowing for if we in a future year do have a significant increase in that pre-K level, we create our budget next year. So next year we see an increase, we can look at that because then we have the number of students that offset that cost. So this is not, again, each year is individual. For this year, this is the recommendation for next year, and then we'll look at what the pre-K enrollment is again for the following year. There's also going to be, as Ben kind of alluded to, there are going to be, it's looking for the seriously minimum class sizes and something that we're going to have to, consider as we look in the future about our distribution of classes and students and instructional opportunities. It's something that many of us are having conversations with Montpelier. It's great to have Charlie here to represent that. So there's a lot of consideration. And I think Melissa made a good recommendation here.
Yeah, so can I just clarify, did you say there's 20 kids then that are pre-K and kindergarten combined? And is that consistent across all of the schools in the district that pre-K and kindergarten would be combined?
So currently Reading is a pre-KK, Barnard will be a pre-KK because it's not 20 total. It's based on the numbers here, it's about between 12 and 15, those two grades combined, so that we can still offer a pre-K program and a kindergarten program. That was the accommodation that we've made. The other, Killington has capacity and the need for one full-time pre-K teacher and paraeducator, and Wes is 4. So we really looked at, again, that's back to that presentation that we did with Ben, is looking at where our numbers are currently when we were making these decisions and what were the needs in each of the building. And that's why a kindergarten teacher was cut at, a pre-K teacher was cut at Killington.
Okay, and so if the wait list isn't long enough, for example, you don't anticipate keeping a pre-K separate from the kindergarten? Because I know I am on the wait list. I don't have pre-K now for my 3-year-old. So I'm curious, just, what the options would be aside from me just looking for other pre-K.
Yeah, the current budget does not provide us with the capacity to add another pre-K teacher at Barnard.
Okay, thank
Do we
you.
have options of other campuses that have space for pre-K? They are all full, all the wait list. But not enough of a waiting list to justify adding another.
And so that's a half person that we've cut from there.
Correct.
And there's no room in the budget for half of a person.
Nope.
Okay.
No.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, thanks everybody for the questions. Really appreciate the interaction. Paige, you're a superstar.
You guys are right now.
Yeah. Hope everybody has a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have to